Started. All right, be opening your Bibles up to 2 Samuel chapter 23. I know it's been a while since we've looked at this, either me being out of town or having schoolwork to do. Not only am I teaching school now, but I'm also back in school because I have to finish up a program at Ole Miss to get my permanent standard teaching license. So gotten a little bit busier this past couple weeks. So 2 Samuel chapter 23. We know that this is sort of the last section of the book that began back in chapter 21. Again, the things that are in this section are not necessarily in chronological order. Chapter 23, at least the first 7 verses, are kind of an exception to that. And we're going to just try to get as far as we can into the chapter. So again, 2 Samuel 23, we are looking now at what is called, or at least what the writer calls, the last words of David. Now we know that, if we were to read over into 1 Kings, we are going to see that there's a little bit of a similarity between what David says here and then what he will eventually tell Solomon when David is on his deathbed. And the words here are going to deal with essentially what should the next king of Israel do, or at least what should be his policy, especially what is his policy when it comes to dealing with the subjects within his own kingdom. And there's some things that we can point out in these verses about how we can relate to one another, but maybe more so importantly, how we relate to people that are under us, whether that's in our workplace, whether that's in our family, which may be the more pressing application for most of us in here. And we'll notice that as we go along. But notice that in 2 Samuel chapter 23, beginning in verse 1, the text says that these are the last words of David. Thus says David, the son of Jesse. Thus says the man raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. Now, there are 4 really different types of descriptors here given to the character, the identity of David. Obviously, we know that David is the son of Jesse. We saw that all the way back in 1 Samuel 16. David was the youngest of the sons of Jesse that was chosen to be the king of Israel. And of all these indicators, perhaps this is the one that's least notable to us. Now obviously David probably loved his father, but the 3 other descriptors that follow are kind of in a way a little bit more important for our purposes. Notice that David is also the man that was raised up on high. Notice again here that you have what's called passive voice. David did not do the raising up himself. David did not raise himself up on high. But the indication here is that somebody else raised him up on high. And we know that from chapter 22, where, in several different instances, David pointed out that, God put him in a position where he could be king over Israel. And that was, of course, because of David being a man after God's own heart. God was the one who promoted him, put him in a position to be successful. Likewise, he's anointed of the God of Jacob. Think about the term anointed. A lot of times, again, it was connected to the idea of a king being selected. A king's anointed. That means that he is being accepted as the king. Of course, Jesus was known as the Messiah, the anointed one. Not because he was selected as a king, a physical king on the earth, but because he's going to be the head of the church. He's anointed in that sense, chosen by the God of Jacob, just as David was over the king of Israel. And of course, he's the sweet psalmist of Israel. And we know that David was an individual who liked to write songs, as we saw in chapter 22 and as we see throughout the book of Psalms. And these are all indicators of David, but again, what we have here is that David is in this position because God has put him there. That follows then in verse 2, where it says that the Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. These are words that David is very clear are not just coming from his own opinion. David's not giving his own personal advice in this section, but the indication to us is that this is something that God wanted David to directly say. Now, we know, of course, that God, we talked about that in the book of Revelation. God doesn't do that today, right? When John penned the last words of the book of Revelation, the end, God has not spoken to man in that way, at least through inspiration, since when John wrote the book of Revelation. But, of course, that wasn't the case back in the Old Testament. God did inspire men to speak and to write. And what David is saying here is that I have been inspired to give this piece of advice. His word was on my tongue. David was a man who's not going to reject pronouncing the words of God. So the God of Israel, the Rock of Israel, again, the idea of God being the protector of Israel. Notice what he says there again, verse 3, he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Now that's important because that directly comes from the character of God. The king of Israel was supposed to, in a lot of ways, embody the characteristics of God himself, right? The king of Israel is supposed to lead Israel, not just physically, but he's supposed to lead spiritually. And if he leads spiritually, he has to emulate, he has to demonstrate the characteristics that are particularly pertain to God. One of which is that he must be just. We've noticed that the term just carries the idea of being fair. God placed a very big emphasis in the Old Testament on the Israelites to be just, especially just to one another, which is essentially what David is talking about here. But God put a specific emphasis on the idea of being fair to one another, especially among the people in Israel. Remember that when we've looked at the book of Habakkuk, right, one of the first things that Habakkuk complained about to God was that there was basically internal strife. Justice was perverted. We'll sort of build on that again in the lesson this morning, but Habakkuk's chief concern was that the people of Israel are wicked because they don't know how to be fair to one another. The righteous are not protected by the law, the wicked get away. That is something that was characteristic of a lot of the writings of the other prophets in the Old Testament. Amos pointed that out in at least 2 chapters. When we looked at the book of Amos, he pointed out that God was upset because either it was the rich that were exploiting the poor or the wicked exploiting the righteous. He did not like the idea of his people being unfair to one another. Now, when we look at what David's saying here, that principle maybe more so specifically applies to the king, because the king is in a position where it can be very easy for him to not be fair, or it can be very easy for him to take advantage of a situation. Think about this in the workplace. If a employer or a boss is looking at the relationship between him and his employees, sometimes the boss might think to himself, well, I'm the boss, I make the most money, I don't necessarily have to put in the same level of work as the people underneath me, right? I can tell them what to do because I'm the boss, and they have to do what I say. I think that also is a theme that comes out when it comes to the idea of playing favorites. I know most of y'all in here are parents. If you're parents that have multiple kids, you know that there are a lot of dangers that can come if you as a parent show favoritism towards one of your children over the other. Or if you have grandchildren, if you show favoritism towards one grandchild over the other, that can lead to relationship problems. That can lead to relationship problems not between you and your children or grandchildren, but also between children and grandchildren themselves when things are not fair. And you know, sometimes maybe you do that because you're older and you've got more experience and you're sort of, again, looked at as a leader within the home or, you know, a leader within the family. Well, there are problems when that happens. And what David, through inspiration based on what we have in verses 2 and 3, what David is giving here, at least to the advice to the next king, you might have the ability to not be fair because you're a king, but don't do it, essentially. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And the king here has to think about this in light of God himself, right? God created the universe, right? He created the world. God can do whatever he wants, and yet God chooses to be just in how he rules over his people. And that indication to the next king is, look, as God is just to you, just as he was just to David to put him in a position where David did not earn that position, likewise, you have to be just towards your fellow man because God was fair to you, more so than what you deserve. So he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Notice, for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5, because here David is talking, and perhaps, and I know it doesn't directly say, but perhaps this is in light of David talking to Solomon later on, again, a man in David's own house. Notice what's said in Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5, talking about a future descendant in the house of David. I can get there. There we go. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. Well, the idea of being just is carried over in that idea, in the very last line in verse 5, to execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. So Jeremiah is writing there that there's going to be somebody in the house of David that is going to come, and he is going to reign as a just ruler, at least in a spiritual sense. And who is this talking about? Yeah, Jeremiah 23 verse 5, this is a reference to Jesus. So, he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. That is something that is characteristic of Jesus. It should be characteristic of the King of Israel. And that should also be characteristic of us when it comes to our relationship at work, when it comes to our relationship within our family. We have to be fair to everyone that we are around. We cannot show partiality or favoritism because that can lead to a lot of problems. If I did that as a teacher, if I was very partial in how I graded, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble, not just with my principal, but also with my students as well. You just can't do that. But now notice verses 4 down through verse 7. Or notice verse 4, what is the outcome of a just ruler? Verse 4, he shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. What is the outcome of a man who is just as a ruler? Well, the indication in verse 4 is at least looking through nature. If a ruler is just, everything will turn out fine. What's being described here in verse 4 is basically the ideal perfect day. Obviously, the ideal perfect day has to begin with the fact that the sun rises, right? He shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises. Tonight, if we were to go to bed and we wake up tomorrow and the sun never rose, we're in trouble because we're not going to survive very long without sunlight, whether that's for heat, whether that's for the process of plants creating oxygen. We're in a lot of trouble if the sun doesn't rise in the morning. Well, if you are an unjust ruler, you're going to have a lot of problems yourself, as what will happen with Solomon's son later on. But he shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises. No doubt, too, we might think about this from the perspective of that just ruler that we noted in Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5. Dad, if you would, turn over to John chapter 8 and verse 2. And I'll look at John chapter 1 and verse 9. Yeah, let me get to John 1 verse 9 first before you read. These Apologetics Press Bibles are very good. They've got a lot of good articles in them. The only downside of that is you have to do a lot more page turning because they put the articles right there in the middle of the book, which, I mean, that's fine, but you do have to turn a lot more. John 1 verse 9. Notice what's said about Jesus. That was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. Now read John 8 and verse 2. Was that John 8 verse 2? I might have had the wrong text written down. Well, anyway, you get the idea from John chapter 1 and verse 9, right? Jesus was the light of the world, a light in darkness. And that deals with the fact that he is just. And you can see that on a number of different instances. Whether that's in John, well, so later on in John chapter 8, so like for instance, Jesus is just. John chapter 8, for instance. Remember that when the man brought that adulterous woman before Jesus, and the men wanted Jesus to either, they kind of wanted him to slip up and make a mistake. And Jesus' whole point in that, remember that Jesus made the point in that occasion that, for a woman to commit adultery, there has to be a man involved, right? So if we're going to be fair here, two people have to be put to death and not just the woman. Because if you caught her in the act of adultery, the man has to be put to death as well. Because that's what fairness is. That's justice. Well, of course, the men don't bring forward the man that was also guilty of adultery, and so the matter's dismissed. That's an example of Jesus being just as a leader, at least in that sense. Well, the offspring of David, at least when he becomes king, has to be just as well. That will make things go well. Verse 4, again, he'd be like the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds. Now, obviously, we need rain. We need that for crops. We need that obviously for farmers. Obviously, need rain. But a morning without clouds, you're thinking about a picture-perfect day. It's the type of day that you want to spend time outside. Friday night, I was at one of my students' football games, and Friday night it rained a whole lot. I got drenched. Not great football weather because it's not fun sitting there while it's raining. But a morning without clouds is a picture-perfect day, like the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. And that there is a reference to, again, the good that does come from rain. Tender grass springing out of the earth. That's how things should be. You have days where it's sunny, you have a picture-perfect day. That's balanced out with days that rain, that allow for crops to grow. That's the picture-perfect day for a farmer, we could say. And the point is, just as that is a picture-perfect setting for a farmer, a just ruler over Israel is a picture-perfect setting for Israel's prosperity moving forward. Because there won't be internal strife if the ruler is doing what he should be doing. And while David was not perfect, in a lot of ways, David was a pretty just ruler. And we've seen that in prior instances where David had shown mercy towards individuals that probably weren't very deserving. of that mercy. Now notice verses 5 and 7. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase? But the sons of rebellion shall all be as thorns thrust away, because they cannot be taken with hands. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they shall be utterly burned with fire in their place. Now, verse 5 is then a reference to the fact, again, that God put David's house in a position to basically be the dynasty of Israel moving forward. Right? You know, and again, the very first part of verse 5 goes again back to the point that David, at least initially, did not deserve the throne, right? God put him in that position. But now notice what he says following that. And this references all the way back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. God's made a covenant with David's house. And as he says there in verse 5, will he not make it increase? And that's the motivation given probably here to Solomon, that moving forward, you can have confidence in God because of this covenant he has made. And the covenant being, my house is going to continue on. You will continue on. You don't have to be like Saul and worry about what's going to happen to, what's going to happen to the kingdom after I'm gone. You don't have to worry about a challenger necessarily like what Saul did if you reign as a just king. And remember that, at least for the most part, Solomon was a pretty just king. Now, he wasn't, when you get to 1 Kings chapter 10, that kind of changes. But notice that the problems in Israel's, at least within David's house, the dynasty of David, remember that those problems began when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, chose to be an unjust ruler, when he tried to make life difficult for the people complaining against his leadership. Well, that's when problems came out. But Solomon, if you're a just ruler, things will go right. And then verses 6 and 7, the overall point being is that while there are people that may try to challenge you, if you do what's right, verse 7, the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear. If you put those wicked people in their place, you don't have to worry about problems occurring. So, rule as a just man, things will go well, verse 5. And then verses 6 and 7, those that try to rebel, if you handle them as you should, they will be destroyed and you will continue to prosper. Now, we might point out here that it is under the leadership of Solomon that a lot of idolatry is introduced by the foreign wives that he marries. That's going to lead to a lot of problems for basically the rest of Israel and Judah's history. And so maybe in that sense he doesn't remove that form of wickedness. But this is a reminder about what the next ruler of Israel should do. He should be fair. He should remember his covenant with God. And those that try to disrupt that covenant need to be put in their place. As leaders, we have to do, in whatever capacity we serve as a leader, we have to do the same thing. If it's within our own home, we have to be fair. We have to remember the promises that God has given us for being fair, for being faithful to Him. And at the same time, there are times in order to maintain justice within a family, for instance, we may have to deal with some family members that are not that are taking advantage of somebody else in our family. Or family members that aren't doing the right thing, that need to be, in a way, not necessarily put in their place in that sense, but they need to be corrected. That attitude or action needs to be corrected. For the most part, as a teacher, I've got great kids. Don't really have to worry about the whole, instilling discipline or punishing kids that way. So for me, that's great. But again, sometimes in the workplace, you may have to deal with coworkers or people that work underneath you that are not fair people. They're not good people. And sometimes in order to have a healthy working environment, you have to deal with those problems so that they get resolved and so that things become better. And as Christians, that's part of our job, to make sure that we are fair and to make sure that when it comes to people that are doing wrong, that we try to correct that problem any way that we can. All right, with that being said, are there any comments on what we said up through verses 1 through 7?
Probably meant John 8:12 a while ago instead of 8:7. I'm not sure.
Read it for me.
Jesus spake to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Which reinforces what was said in John.
Right. So the light of the world. The light of the world in that case, again, being just. All right, so that's verses 1 through 7. Verses 8 through verses 38 are going to be a list of some of the more prominent individuals that David had serving under him. Again, sometimes, at least in my Bible, it's got the heading David's Mighty Men, which was the heading for this Bible class. We're going to kind of get into it today and talk more about it next time. But we recall that, David was very successful militarily. But we have to remember that David was successful not just because he had God's help, but also because he had help of a lot of men that were faithful and loyal to him. And basically, verses 8 through verse 38, for the most part, is a list that is given to try to remember the heroic deeds of the men that served under David. In this case, this is given in writing. Sometimes we have memorials built on battlefields, and obviously you think about today being the 21st anniversary of 9/11. We have memorials built to the men and women that died trying to get people out of the Twin Towers 21 years ago today. And we build those memorials as a way to commemorate the memory of people who went and performed heroic actions. Well, that's essentially what this section is really focusing on, the heroic actions of these men that served under David. And I know there are a lot of names here. A lot of this is just facts that are being given. But something to keep in mind as we read through this section is how important it is to surround ourselves with the right people in life. David was successful in part because he surrounded himself, for the most part, with the right people in life. I try to reiterate that to my students, especially when they go off to college. You can be successful in college when you surround yourself with the people that are there for the right reasons. People that are there to work hard and get through college. You surround yourself with the right people in life, it's going to make life a whole lot easier for you. You're going to be able to get out of a lot of problems because you got friends to rely on for help. David did a fairly good job of that, and this is again a commemoration of those individuals that helped David out in his life. Now, Dad, I'm not going to make you read these names. I'm going to read them myself. Do what? Angie, you want to read the names? Okay. So we're going to kind of read through this. We may come back and talk about some of these some of these specific individuals next time. But again, these are heroic actions that are being described. Let's just read down through verse 12, and then we'll circle back and maybe look through this a little bit more specifically. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had: Joshabashebeth, the Tachmonite, chief among the captains. He was called Adino the Eznite because he had killed 800 men at one time. And after him was Eleazar the son of Dodo the Ahoahite, one of the three mighty men with David when they had defied the Philistines who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel had retreated. He arose and attacked the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand stuck to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to plunder. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines had gathered together into a troop where there was a piece of ground full of lentils. So the people fled from the Philistines, but he stationed himself in the middle of the field, defended it, and killed the Philistines. So the Lord brought about a great victory. All right, notice the first individual, Josheb-Basshebeth, a Tachmonite. I'll have to go back and look next time about what this name, he's called Adeno the Eznite, to see what it literally means. We are told here, though, that he was given this name because he had killed 800 men at one time. Now, we know that angels are very powerful. An angel of the Lord, how many individuals did the angel of the Lord kill in Sennacherib's army in the book of Isaiah? Yeah, 185,000 men killed pretty much in one night. That's an incredible amount of men to kill. Yet here's an individual that, at least the text indicates to us, that he killed 800 men at one time. And we're not necessarily given the instance how that happened, but obviously this is a man that's pretty powerful to be able to do this. I think it was the judge Shamgar that killed, how many men he killed with an ox goad? He killed a lot of men too. And that's, obviously we don't know a whole lot about who this individual is, but the fact that he kills 800 men shows that he is a man of an immense power. When I read through this section, I think about superheroes, to me, at least, because of some of the actions that are being described here. So you got one man that kills 800 men at one time, and we're actually out of time. Let's just go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up with this next time and try to point out some other points of application that can come in this section. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning. We'll pick up looking at verses 8 through 12 next time.